If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello Internet, I'm glad to tell you that we got a sponsor for this video, and I wish to thank the sponsor for keeping the legacy dream alive and supporting the legacy which we're creating here for the South African security forces. And if any of you watching here wish to advertise on legacy, just contact me. But for now, let us see what our sponsor has to say and let us support our sponsor as well. Thank you.
OTT Technologies is a global leader in the design, development, manufacturing, delivery and logistical support of protected vehicles. Established in 1980 in South Africa, we have built and supplied hundreds of specialized and remanufactured vehicles to UN-sanctioned peacekeeping missions, NGOs, contractors and governments. This includes support vehicles, mine-protected APCs and specialized police and military vehicles, all manufactured in our facilities in South Africa and in the United States. Our in-house engineering development and design division ensures that we aren't reliant on third parties or independent contractors and gives us the ability to react quickly and efficiently to our customers' requirements. Our vehicles are tested in controlled and real-life battle conditions, and protection claims are corroborated by independent third-party certifications. In an effort to expand an already lucrative menu of products and services, OTT acquired LMT Products and ADG Mobility to add new dimension to its already formidable offerings. LMT provides additional products and capabilities, and ADGM brings a class-leading capability in design and protection, specifically flat-bottom mine protection. We offer global after-sales service, training and product support to our clients. Integrated lifecycle support and product lifecycle support is an integral part of our product support service and commitment to our customers. This can be tailored according to the need and requirement of each client. Commissioning of the vehicles and sign-over takes place at a location as prescribed by the client. The vehicles will be inspected and tested to ensure no transport damages. We ensure no longer available parts or NLA is supported and available by dedicated procurement members. The integrated parts catalog is provided to the client to order spares. We offer basic driver training, difficult terrain driving training or advanced drivers, maintenance training and logistics training. In order to receive a competence certificate, trainees must pass various theoretical and practical assessments. Our technicians can be deployed to assist our clients with maintenance, repair and in-service training. We offer technical and maintenance support for up to 1 year or periodic support as required. During the warranty period, our specialists will assist clients with suitable solutions, and clients use the feedback and failure report system. Our mobile workshop repair system is just one module of an entire system designed to support OTT's products in the field. The workshop is equipped with high-quality tools and machinery that provides for easy and user-friendly repair in the field. OTT enjoys a world-renowned reputation of excellence and battle-proven products that operate throughout the world.
Hello Internet, we are back and I'm excited because you've been asking for this episode for a long time. Who I have here in front of me is Marius Scheepers. Now you remember him, Vito Battalion officer. He gave us his life story. It was fantastic, it was well received. The man's an attorney. I wanted to use the word lawyer, but more correctly is an attorney. I believe he studied at the same university as me, but he was very long before me, even if he looks younger than me, but that's a good bond. That was a damn good university. And he's also an author. He wrote 2 books. I had the privilege of reading one of them, and he's also a historian. And today he's going to talk to us about the bloodiest battle in the Angolan War, or the South African Border War, which took place from 1966 to 1989. And it is called Firewood. Now, you will recall also, all of you listening here, that we had actually some people talking about Firewood, but not in detail, about the role of Tureki, which I played there. A fantastic episode that was, and from that came a lot of questions. What happened at Firewood? Now, in his book, Move of the Border, that's what the book is called. I'll flash it here for you on the screen. Please go and buy that book. It's a damn good book, I can tell you. I read it. And normally when you read this type of academic books, sometimes they get boring. This one is not boring at all. It's just reading. But it is an academic book. You can see from all the footnotes, Marius, I must congratulate you on that book. It is fantastic. And then, of course, you wrote another book about your service in 3-2 Battalion, I suppose. Striking Inside Angola with 3-2 Battalion. Also an excellent book. Everybody who read it told me it's excellent. And we have to speak about that book as well in the future. But thank you for your time. I know you're a busy man. It's over to you. Please tell us about Firewood.
Chris, thanks again. It's a huge privilege, and I'm very excited, and I was looking forward to this interview. It's really an honor to be able to participate, and an honor to be, as an author of a book, to be able to share the story with you. Now, first of all, I must just make the remark, apart from you having people with first account experiences, I am just the author. I am the researcher and I'm the storyteller. Why do I tell the story? Because there is a story to be discovered and a story to be told. And of course, you won't believe it, this story was a secret. It was hidden for many, many years, over 30 years. When I came across the story, and it intrigued me so much that it happened that it ended up in my studies, a master's degree study. And my dissertation was about the battle at Indungo, about OPS Firewood, which I undertook. Now, let me just take you back. So you mentioned my first book was published by Hillian in London and 30 Degrees South in about 2012. Following that book, I decided that I wanted to do a more scientific research. So I registered with the University of Pretoria for a master's degree in history. My aim was actually to do my master's on Operation Ascari, which we covered in the previous episode. But for some reason, my research proposal was presented and it was rejected. So I had to find another topic. So at the university was Professor Malambu, Professor Berg and Professor Francois Pretorius. So I had to complete 2 subjects. On the age of 50, I was sitting in a class with people half my age going through the studies, but it was interesting. So we focused on methodology and historiology, which thankfully both subjects I passed the exams. And that equipped me, I think, with a great deal to be able to meaningful attempt the study. Now, I started with a study under the guidance of Professor Francois Pretorius. And I must tell you, it was not easy going forward. We had hours and hours of deliberations and a lot of comments that I had to entertain, but at the end we pushed through, and the product was a master's degree. Master's degree lasted for 7 years. Now, it's unimaginable that the fight that took place for not more than 10 hours, but it took me 7 years to research this fight. And that is perhaps try to explain to you how difficult this task is. First of all, I had to get access to the resources, and I had a bit of a conflict to get all these resources to get allowed to have access to these resources. Now, as a historian, Chris, you should understand, in compiling a research, you need to focus on various sources. So you've got obviously your oral evidence. That is, Chris, what you are actually very good at. You're achieving to get people that was on the spot at the location to share their stories. So that is a very important source to have interviews with the people. And I was quite fortunate that I managed to have interviews with another people. Now, if I can just quickly share a screen. Right, so there you have three gentlemen. To the left is Chris Rulofse. He's from the Rekkies. In the middle is Johan Kruis. He's from 1 Parachute Battalion. On the right is Chris Snyman. He's for 101 Battalion. Very smart gentlemen, people that actually achieved a great deal in their future careers. So this was with the launch of a book in 2020. It was right in the middle of a COVID. So we couldn't have a big occasion. Okay, let's just continue where we left off. So I had their contribution, but you can't not rely purely on oral evidence. A very important part of research is to look at your primary sources. Now, your primary source would be the operational reports and the information that was actually written down at the time of this incident. Now, the Defence Force have very good archival service, and these reports are contained, and I had access to all these reports, about 4 or 5 of them. And then you had your secondary sources. That is more like authors writing the stories, newspaper and media releases. So all this comes together, and you analyze this, and because you have to follow a strict discipline, you have to source for this information and make sure that the end result that you present is as close to the truth. There's no place for fiction in history. So I must submit that although this research is never perfect, but I think I got the closest to a result that you can. And I think the breakthrough came when I got hold of 2 sources. The one very little information, a book from Dr. Louis Botma, onderkant Kutu Carnaval, just briefly mentioning this operation. So that confirmed that the officer in command of the operation was in fact Colonel James Hill, or Hills. The correct spelling is Hills. And from another source of Ian Eis, Rolof Honor, I managed to come across a story told by the 5 gentlemen that received the honoris crux. A very short insert. There were a few mistakes, but from that I actually gathered how the operation actually took place. So the sequence of events. So that was a breakthrough, and I think that actually broke the story and made this publication or this dissertation possible. So from the dissertation, I had 6 chapters, Koos, and from the 6 chapters, I included those 6 in my book. And then I added in the book, Move a Border, as you mentioned, the history of the greatest battles of Angolan border war. I included 6 more chapters. So the book consists of 12 chapters. Now, the book was released in 2020 by 30 Degrees South. Now, just why a book and not purely leave it with a dissertation? And let me just get one step back before I answer that question. I always also manage, and the co-author was Professor Frans van Pretorius, to publish an academic article in Stellenbosch University's journal, the Scientia Militaria. It was published in the volume 49-2, and that was under the heading, The Loss of Military Equipment by the SADF during the Angolan Border War. And that also serves an interesting story. And then I am indebted to a person, Professor Andre Wessels from the Free State University. He managed to write a review on the book in the Brill journal. The Brill journal is, I think, a Belgian journal. It's in existence for more than 350 years. So it was quite a honor that he saw the need to do the book review in this acclaimed journal, and it was a very positive review. I'm very grateful for that. Right. So back at the book. So the reason why I wrote the book, Koos, is perhaps to try and understand how the war revolved over 23 years. Now, if you have a book that long, it's almost 2 generations that participated in that war. How do you understand? How do all the different parts of a war fit together? So it was important for me to find which parts of a war can be focused on. So I managed to divide the war into 6 parts. And if I may share another screen with you right now. So the 6 parts is purely to understand the war. So there you find the 6 parts. Let's just briefly refer to it. The first part is the beginning of a war. That is when the military wasn't involved. It's low intensity conflict with low scale military involvement. That first 10 years. Second part, completion for power of Angola become independent state in 1995. So that was that separate Operation Savannah. In my book, I actually dealt there with primary sources. So that is an important contribution in the book. The third part, you have cross-border operations in the shallow area of southern Angola before 1980. Then the fourth part, we focused on the previous talk, that was cross-border operations, this time in the deep central area of southern Angola for the next 3 years. Then we have a brief period where South Africa withdrew from Angola, and we had the covert guerrilla warfare in southern Angola in those 2 years. That is mainly where 3rd Battalion acted and they mimicked UNITA's guerrilla force. And then the last part, the big land battles, are referred to as the semi-conventional battles and total warfare in southern Angola up until the end of the war in 1988. So that gives you indication, and these are the topics of some of the headings. Now, there's also a list coming up of what I refer to as specific operations quiz. So every year during all these phases, the Defence Force had at least 1, sometimes 2 big major operations. They are major because those operations turned the tide. It actually had an influence on the direction and outcome of a war. One year, perhaps what is missing is 1979, but I believe 2 of operations, Operation Richtstock and Operations of Fran, could also be inserted under that year. But there you have a list of the different operations, the areas, and the D-days, the primary times of these operations. Now, just one mention before we get to our topic. There is a perception that the war started on the 26th of August 1966. Now, I also analyzed that perception. That was with the big operation at Ugumulubashe, that was Operation Bloodiest, that has been a joint police and military force with Alouette helicopters attacked the SWAPO base. So authors regard that to be the start of a war. And if you think about it, because a war don't just start, suddenly there's a base on your territory and you attack the base. So in my research, I come across a book of a gentleman, a SWAPO, who wrote a book, Don't Follow the Wolf. And from that book, it appears that that perception is wrong. SWAPO sent 3 small groups called G1, G2, and G3. In 1965, there was political activity in the Oshikati area. Those guys were arrested. But the first armed components of SWAPO, the Plan People's Liberation Army, entered the border, and there was a confrontation with a local police force in the Rundu area around about 20 to 20 through March 1966. Now, those SWAPO members were captured, they were put on trial, and they served lengthy jail sentences on Robben Island. I believe some of them were released in 1985. So the official start of a war, and maybe important in the historic context, is rather the 20th of March 1966 and not the 26th of August, just to clear that issue. Now, just another remark, the nature of the war, the South African War, is also covered in a chapter, and one have to understand why is the war in Angola different from what you find. Like, you know, you have a situation with Ukraine now with the Russians and the Ukrainians, they have a standoff, there's a lot of artillery taking place with a bit of infantry, but these two opposing forces facing each other. That was never like that, perhaps with the exception, the last part, Operation Modular, but then there was also a cat and mouse game taking place. So it was not really two forces facing each other like we have now. One author described this, and he actually referred to a statement made by General Constant Viljoen. He was the head of the army in 1980 to 1985. And he made a statement that's interesting. He said that the SADF implemented a revised doctrine of mobile warfare, which differed significantly from the philosophy which had underpinned strategies for fighting wars in the past. So if you refer to the typical conventional wars, this is different, which he referred to as a traditional South African way of fighting a war. For Viljoen, his revised doctrine was, and listen to this, based on not to hold ground. So it is not a territorial fight, but to create a design of battle in such a way that you would lure the enemy into a killing ground, and then by using superiority of firepower, that is where your rattles and your heavy weapons come in. And movement, it is very fast movement. You would kill him completely. And this is typically what happened in this war. You had fights, territorial fights where you had to find the enemy. But what was interesting in Angola, you also had targets, and you attacked the targets as part of it. So that's just a side remark, just to understand why this war is different. So young people, perhaps watching this program, have an interest in the war. I would advise them to perhaps, when they do get hold of my book, and there are other sources as well, you'll find that my book have footnotes, and there are references in the footnotes. Now, the footnotes is on the page, and it was done in a specific manner. So on the same glance, when you read the story, you can see the footnote. And those resources, where you see those books, those may be resources that you need to have access. So in gaining more knowledge about the war, it may be worth your while if you can have access to that. and therefore you'll make a better understanding of a war. I know a lot of new publications are released. Chris, you are also contributing a lot, and I'm quite curious to also read some of the material that you also produce. Now, Chris, let's start with the topic, and I have to take you back in time. So at the previous session, we ended at the end of 1983 with the peace accord was signed after Operation Askari. And the purpose was that the Joint Monitoring Commission should monitor the operational area, that is the southern Angola, where the forces may be active, and where there is infringements to react. Now this lasted for about a year and a half, but there were about over 140 infringements recorded by SWAPO, and also the Defence Force also had a handful of infringements. And this monitoring condition and this state of fairly peace period didn't last long. During this period, we had the fifth stage, that I refer to in my book. That is where 3rd Battalion participated at OPS Forte, and they had a large incident contact with SWAPO on the 11th of February 1985, which is also covered in the book. So let's just look at what happened up until we get to the fighting at Ndungo during Operation Firewood. So Chris, for this purpose, I perhaps just want to put a map on the screen. Right, so our friend Google is going to give us assistance. So we've got Southern Africa. So you've got the capital Pretoria, around about there. If we move to Namibia, you have got your air logistical base at Grootfontein. Windhoek is the capital of Namibia. And then the operational areas more or less here, where you have places which we can identify there. You have Rundu, which we'll talk about later. That is sector 20. And then we're in the middle, we've got the cat line, that is where the border is. You've got Ondangwa, Oshikati to the south. You've got Umatia, that is where 6-1 Mac was stationed, and then Esewelo. Esewelo was a training ground, we refer to that. Then further to the north, in Angola, you have a capital of the Kunene province, that's on Jiva. To the west on the Kunene River, you've got Zongongu. And then north, you've got areas like Anhanka, Ivale. Then there's a place, Neoni, and Dover is not on the map, it's right there. So you've got this main road, and we'll talk about this main road, but leads north, and it passes important places like Mupa. I'm sure there's Mupa. And it goes north, it goes past Wintisek. There's a place of Tsetsemetet. Then you have got Kasinga, a familiar name, and then right at the top, very, very far. And that's almost where this road ends, because the next you get the railway line. You've got a place called Ndungo. Now, Ndungo, of course, is the place of OPS Firewood. Now, why is this operation important? 3 reasons stands out. First of all, it's the deepest SWAPO base what was ever attacked, deepest in Angola, 285 kilometers into Angola, what the South African Task Force attacked. The second reason is that was the day that South African Defence Force suffered the most casualties on a single day, and it was almost at the end of the year. The third reason, and there's perhaps a fourth, is that it was the last time a South African task force actually attacked the SWAPO base and entered the base. There were more attacks, but this was the last time it was a full-out attack. And the fourth reason is this attack was launched by a very special group of very special units, namely the 2 and 5 Recce regiments, the best soldiers in the trained soldiers in the Defence Force. You had 1 parachute battalion, and then the so-called Ovambo battalion, 101 battalion. Those are the reaction force guys traveling mainly on Casper armored vehicles. Now, let's just look at the situation. So they received their training here at Oshivalu, and they moved all the way to the north, to Rundu, which you have there. They crossed the border at the Cat Line, almost there. They continued north to Ihonde, which we will also find in the map somewhere. There's Ihonde. And from Ihonde, they traveled in the eastern side all the way to the base. And you can just see what distance they traveled. It's quite far at Ihonde. So here's the road, where it is. So it's a north. Okay, sorry, there's Ihonde. Right, so that's more or less just to look at the map and to just to get our bearings right. Okay, so Chris, let's just go back. So we had the Defence Force starting engaging SWAPO. Now, when South Africa withdraw, all the major towns that I showed on the map, like Onjiva, Monongwe, Zongongu, and Kasinga, and Kuvalai, they all were fortified by FAPLA. So FAPLA moved back. They even built major airstrips and runways at Zongongu, and there's an airstrip at Monongwe and one at Kutukunaval. So FAPLA, the Angolan forces, actually took possession of that area which we had before. So South Africa still managed to be involved, but now remember, you don't have air superiority. Definitely, you cannot send in your Pumas and your gunships like we did, as I described in the previous episode. So the game quite changed significantly. Also, you couldn't deploy soldiers by helicopter. So now you're more relying on vehicles, your troop carriers like the Buffel. It's also an light armored vehicle, and obviously a vehicle like the Casper, because I'm sure you're very familiar with the Casper. It's got a very thin armor. It is not really a proper armored vehicle, but both these vehicles have a capability of when in a landmine explosion. So they'll protect you from landmines. That's very important in that area. So now you have to move around in vehicles, and that created new challenges. So during this phase, the unit 101 battalion actually came to the front. Now, you know, over the years, we had units that stand out, and perhaps let me refer to what was said by General Constant Viljoen. He was the chief of the Defence Force. I believe he favored, well, he was a guy from artillery, but I think he favored the parabats, if I must say, if I read through the lines. He was succeeded by General Jannie Geldenhuys, and there's no doubt about it. He favored 3-2 Battalion because both his sons served at 3-2 Battalion. Martin was actually tragically killed on the runway while at 3-2 Battalion in Pomfret. And then a few years later, at that stage, still the South West African territorial force of the SADF. The chief was at that stage General George Myron. Now, he also he was the last chief of the Defense Force. And there's articles that he actually had the soft spot for 101 Battalion for various reasons. So these forces played a major role. So in 1985, after all this took place, there was a big operation, Egret, also listed as a specific operation, the 12th of September. That happened in the Niahone area, the Dover area. A force of 500 soldiers from 101 Battalion, it's 6 to 12 teams and 3 to battalion. They operated in the area and they had strict orders to avoid the fortified main centers where FOPLA was. So they were still seeking SWAPO bases without air support, purely making use of convoys, which actually make it much more difficult. So they had about 9 contacts, 15 soldiers, SWAPOs were killed and 103 SWAPOs were captured during Egret. Now, let's just turn our attention a bit to the east. You also have 2 operations, Operation Southern Cross and Operation Alpha Centauri. Southern Cross was in June 86 and Alpha Centauri was in August 86. Now, what happened is, while we are focusing on SWAPO, FOPLA was starting to gather their forces. They were supplied with major equipment. We will get to that later. So they had 4 brigades. The 8th and the 13th came from the north, and the 7th and 25th brigade. Now, FOPLA brigade is anything in the region of 800 to 2,000 soldiers. It is a major, it's your biggest unit. Just for the people that don't know, 4 platoons forms a company, 4 companies forms a battalion, and 4 battalions, in South Africa terms, that's 3,000 soldiers, normally forms a brigade. Now, we didn't fought our war in Angola according to a scale of brigades. We had task forces. So task forces had various components. So you compiled your force according to the need, and you'll see there was a specific need, how the task force for firewood was compiled. So FOPLA moved to the southwest, southeast. They tried to attack Mavinga, that is where the rebellion force UNITA was situated, and we couldn't afford that UNITA should lose those battles. So FOPLA came as close as 5 kilometers to Mavinga. So South Africa had a few guys from CSI that actually assisted UNITA, and UNITA was supposed to engage FOPLA, but both those operations were not successful. I think Southern Cross actually didn't even materialize. But what we did do, 2 things happened. At that stage, I believe America already handed over the Stinger surface-to-air missiles, a very potent weapon that was displayed in Afghanistan. I think that turned the tide in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union at that stage. So the result is that there was quite big air battles taking place. The South African Air Force, as a result, have downed 4 Mi-17 helicopters, 5 Mi-24 Hind helicopters, a FOPLA transport aircraft carrying 21 FOPLA and 7 Soviet officers was also shot down. And also later 4 Angolan Alouette helicopters. So the Angolas had tremendous loss. Their logistical supplies was disrupted, and they had to abandon that operation with their 4 brigades. At the end, there's the figures, 3 MiG-21s was shot down by the Stingers, 2 MiG-23s, and more than $12 million worth of equipment was destroyed. So UNITA did have some success during that battles. Now, I must just mention, as part of the success of Africa, with the aid of 3 Battalion, 3 Battalion was turning into a different type of unit. They now supplied by armor in the form of 90mm rifles. They also had anti-aircraft component, and then they have the multi-rocket launchers. So during that operation, elements of 3 Battalion and a 1,500 strong force from UNITA, they counterattacked. So at that point, South Africa made use of a new weapon. And I must say to you, the G5 155mm Howitzer from Sahara battery of 6-1 Mac. Chris, when we introduced that weapon, and the first shot was fired in that area, and then they focused their attention to Kutu-Kunaval. First shot was fired on the 6th of August 1986. That gun changed the outcome of a war. South Africa had one of the most superior Howitzer guns in the world. It had an effective, accurate reach of 48 kilometers, and it extends as far as 65 kilometers. There's nothing the Soviet Union closely could use to resemble that gun. Now, you should understand, because if your arm length from fighting is further than your opponent, is a boxing match, you've got the advantage. So there the war changed. And these guns, together with the 127mm Valkyrie multi-rocket launchers, that's what multi-tube launchers, similar to the Stalin Oral that the Soviet Union used, but a bigger weapon. They hammered Kutu-Kunaval, and they destroyed a lot of equipment and helicopters on the runway. So that was the type of war that's taking place at that stage. And there were not big land infantry involved in that operations. Now, at that time, FAPLA was again receiving a lot of equipment in the form of 500 tanks. At the end of the war, we managed to eliminate about 90 to 100 T-54, 55 tanks. But in reserve, they have 500 more tanks. And these included the T-62s. They received the MiG-23s and Sukhoi Su-33 aircraft. So this is major equipment. And then they had another drive towards Mavinga, and that was during operation what we call modular Hooper and Packer. Koos where FAPLA, where they had 4 brigades, now they formed 8 brigades, the 8th, 13th, 16th, 21, 25, 47, 59, and 66 brigade. So there was a major land battle from Monongwe, Kutu-Kunaval, going towards Mavinga. The reason why I give this background is because the large forces of 6-1 Mech, Forsyth, and 3 Battalion was in fact focused on that area. So 3 Battalion, who participated in a number of operations, I just mention Operation Reed Prague was also in the Mupa area, and there was another one, Operation Kakebeen, with various successes. And also 2 companies of 101 Battalion. I think it is 9-1 and 9-4. We will just correct that now. Were also involved there as protection for this artillery taking place. So you had a focus on another front, But the South African Defence Force decided they still have to engage SWAPO. Now, early in 1987, now we're focusing on 87, the year of this Operation Firewood. On the 8th of January, and there's a very little information, 101 Battalion in their Romeo Mike teams, they were working fairly high, higher than Mupa in the Winterset area. And while on their vehicles, remember, their reaction force, and their way of operation was they were in the Caspers on board, and the Casper had at its turret a very effective machine gun, but had a variety of 3.0 Browning machine guns, 5.0 Browning machine guns, and there's even a few Caspers fitted with 20mm guns. So they had a lot of firepower, and they had the advantage of mobility and speed. But it is different than your normal infantry unit. Your parabatch, 32 Battalion, they debased from their vehicles. When they saw any traces of SWAPO, they were not on the vehicles. While 101 Battalion actually had a different method. I think it closely resembles what you also are used of, what Kufut, the police force, used in northern Namibia, Southwest Africa. 32 Battalion had a few encounters. They had standoff mortar attacks on SWAPO bases. There is one incident that they actually, their logistical vehicles drove into an ambush, and there a number of their men, I think it was 5, were killed. Let's not go into too much detail of this. I'll rather have us focus on Firewood. So what happened at Dintisek, that should have spelled, or red flag should have been raised on the way 101 Battalion is operating in an enemy territory. But let's just pause here, and let's just continue and not further continue with that, because 101 was an effective force and they did get a lot of results. So the next we need to move to is an operation called Operation Colosseum. Now, why do I highlight Colosseum? Colosseum took place on the 30th of November 1986. Now, of course, Colosseum was almost a dress rehearsal for what was to come, and that was Operation Firewood. So in that operation, 2 and 5 recce regiments, they were traveling with 45 vehicles, so they had a variety of Caspers. They had Unimogs fitted with 14.5mm and 106mm recoilless guns. They had gas vehicles and logistical vehicles. So this force of 45 vehicles, they also operated in the area more to the east of Ondingo, always fairly deep. Now, just remember, the recce's, they are a specialized group of people. They are highly trained. So one would not expect the recce's to operate as an infantry unit playing the role of an infantry force, but they were capable of doing it. Now, Colosseum was the second time the recce's was actually utilized in a role, in a more standard company infantry role, if I may use that term, light infantry. It takes us back to 1977, because there was an operation Kropduif at Eheki, which the recce's attacked. And there the recce's actually lost 7 of their men, which was quite a high price to pay. So now, almost 10 years later, they had Operation Colosseum. Just briefly, Colosseum, they got information about the SWAPO target. They approached the target with their vehicles, where they managed to have a contact, and they killed 10 SWAPOs. It's not a great deal, but then they received information of another target 12 kilometers away. On their way to the target, driving in their convoy, they actually drove into an ambush that was set by 50 SWAPOs. They managed to fend off the attack, where 2 recce's were wounded. And then on the way, while they were withdrawing, they then engaged SWAPO, and there was a second ambush set by a large force of 120 SWAPOs. And during that fight, SWAPO managed to destroy 2 Casper vehicles. And this time 2 recce's were killed. The previous 2 were wounded. So that was Colosseum. Very deep operation. And this operation was conducted under the command of Colonel James Hills. Now, much experience should have been gained from Colosseum. I'm sure of that. So, Chris, let's talk about Operation Firewood. Operation Firewood, the operation orders was issued in March 1987. Sorry, it's April 1987. It was Operations Instruction 36 of 87. And it was issued by the General Officer Commanding SA Forces for Southwest Africa, Brigadier Frank Besbier. He was in Windhoek. And the instruction was for Colonel James Hills to compile a force, and he was chosen because he was the officer command of the recce's, and he had experience, and he was tasked to launch attack at a base at north of Ndungu. Now, there was a whole range of issues included in the instructions. May I just highlight 4? So this operation had nothing to do with Fapla and the brigades moving towards Mavinga. This operation was purely against SWAPO's People's Liberation Army of Namibia. There were passive air defense regulations, meaning they will not have the support of the Air Force, except perhaps for a short period, but there will not be an Air Force available in the area for various reasons we will get to. It was a strict instruction that the safety of members of equipment must be adhered to. And this operation took place under the auspices of a larger operation, Luxor. Luxor, to my knowledge, was perhaps a code name for an Air Force operation. Right, so they were tasked to attack the SWAPO base north of Ndungu, and this attack was due to take place on the 31st of October 1987. So the attack was against a very important target. It was SWAPO's Central Area HQ and various of its detachments that was north of a little village referred to as Ndungu. And the components that would form part of this task force was made up with 5 recce, that's 5-1, 5-2, and 5-3 recce commandos. 2 recce, that is citizen force recce soldiers. Then there were 2 companies from 1 parachute battalion, Charlie and Delta. Now, Delta was only 2 platoons of a company, while Charlie had a full complement. Now, Charlie actually joined the convoy at a late stage, so Charlie wasn't part of rehearsals. So they were used in a reserve role should something go wrong. So they were not part of a main attack. Then we have what we refer to as 101 Battalion in their Caspers. there was a Casper with electronic warfare signal unit section. Now the signalers, they did radio jamming, they listened into the enemy radio networks, and they had directional capabilities. Very important for a force like this. And then what is quite striking, what is missing from this task force, you don't have the air support, you also don't have, of course, artillery. Now, the only artillery, if I can mention this, is actually infantry, what was made available, and it was mentioned also by your previous speakers, and of course I was listening with great interest to Stanley Button. He had to talk, and he was Recce's intelligence officer, if I'm right, and he referred to various things that I also cover. A very, very interesting discussion we had with him. And then the second discussion of the two Recce members, they were Daryl O'Kelly and Greg Aston. I enjoyed their talk very much. There were actually 4 Rattles fitted with 81mm mortar pipes. So they were mobile, they were in Rattles. And that's the only form of so-called artillery. Now, 81 is not artillery, 120mm is artillery, but that was provided. Now, there was a plea by Colonel Eddie Viljoen. He was at that stage the second command of Sector 10. Previously, he was for officer command of 3rd Battalion. And I said that this force must have more firepower. And they pleaded for the force to at least to have the 127 multi-rocket launchers, the Valkyrie, supplied to them. But that request was turned down, and we will find that had the effect on the operation at the end. So, of course, we mentioned that 101 Caspers, they were from 902 and 903 company, as 901 and 904. They were deployed elsewhere. So the first choice of equipment of 101 Battalion was not with them. They were deployed elsewhere. So I have to be satisfied with a range of vehicles that was actually supplied to 901 and 904 company. So they traveled towards the target, as I showed on the map. So as part of this force, we were very interesting and very prominent people. Let me mention a few. We had Commandant Koos Verby. Also Sergeant Major Koos Moorcroft, he was with the Echelon. We had Sergeant Major James Tuitge. Major Creer from the 101. Also, the Sergeant Major Skitter was from 101. Then may I mention also Major van der Merwe. He was from 2 Recce. And then we also have a very, very big medical component from Captain Pienaar. Sorry, Captain Pienaar was 1 parachute battalion, but we had a medical component. Now, an interesting a remark that I need to make is in the days, and I'm referring to before 1984, when there was casualties, you had access to helicopters that would be able to collect the casualties. Later in the war, we had a very large component of medics that actually formed part of his operations. Now, they had these ambulances, we called it the Rinkels. It's possible that a lot of the treatment could have been taken place at the target. Okay, so the task force consisted of 1,071 soldiers. From that, we have 605 from 101 Battalion, a very large force. 141 was from the Parabat 2 companies. Only 115 from the recce's, and then the rest was made up by supporting personnel. And they, of course, traveled in a convoy consisting of 159 vehicles. Now, the size of this convoy is more than double than the vehicles that was utilized the previous year during Operation Colosseum. Now, 101 call signs was changed. They used new call signs, now referred to as call sign 10, 20, 30, and 40, just to avoid any confusion in this regard. And they were typically reaction force companies. So each company had 4 teams, so 4 platoons, and each platoon had 4 Caspers. And the command Caspers. So each company had 17 Caspers with him. So in total, 101 had 68 Caspers plus another 10. So that's 78 Caspers. Now, just look at the comparison. 5-1 Ricky Commando had 4 Caspers with him. 5-2 had 4 Caspers. 5-3 had a variety of Caspers and buffaloes. It's not clear. 2 Recce, they had, you mentioned what was it, they had 2 buffles. I believe they had 3 buffles. Maybe wrong, according to reports. And then the Delta, the 2 platoons of 1 parachute battalion had 8 buffles. So there's a huge component for 101 battalion and a smaller component with the rest of the force. Now I have to pause again, Chris, and sorry for the confusion. It is not an easy read. This is a complicated operation, which we really have to digest and dissect. So while the main force is moving towards the target, we had a subsidiary operation called Operation Daffodil. Of course, Daffodil was an operation that was taking place in the Kuvelai Mupa area. So they had to form a surprise attack on that area, and they were actually the diversionary force. So the plan was they lure the attention of the main force away by making the enemy believe that is where the attack is going to take place, so that they can be relaxed when the main fight takes place. This force consisted of elements of 101 battalion, and then they had 140 millimeter G2 Hauser guns and the Echelon. But they were more to the south from where Indungu was situated. Now, they also consisted of 10 armored squadron. I believe they were from Walvis Bay. Now, of course, to my surprise, I discovered that 10 armored squadron consisted of Eland armored cars. Now, the Eland is the old French Panhard, you know, the small car with the 4 wheels. Now, it was fitted with a variety of 90 millimeter and perhaps 20 millimeter guns, but it is an outdated vehicle. There's records that already after Opsaskari, there was specific instructions that the Eland should never be utilized across the cat line again. And yet here in 87, we find them, although they're part of a diversionary force, right inside Angola. During Operation Daffodil, there was Air Force airstrikes launched at Kuvelai and Mupa during the period 27 to 30 October. And obviously the artillery came into action. Now, one of their bombardments, they actually had 1 person, South African Defence Force member, killed and 3 wounded by friendly fire, which I believe is also referred to by Stanley Batten during that operation. Right. So this was taking place to the south. Now, the target on Indingo. Now, like any operation, and Chris, perhaps I'm going into detail, but that will describe you, give you an impression on how the Defence Force operated. So before you identify a target, you actually need intel, information. And this is typically where the Iraqis come in. So there was information received from a source. Now, these two Iraqis, and we use code names referred to as Pele and Santos. They were senior SWAPO members, and they were utilized by the Iraqis to reconnoiter the area north of Ndungo. So they had very valuable inside information. So they located the Eastern Area's headquarters, where they situated. They gave information about the layout of a base and the strength of a base. Now, of course, if you have this information, you know what you are against and how big force you need for the attack. So now the intelligence picture was actually almost complete. The next thing is a Iraqi Lieutenant Christo Rolse. He's one of the gentlemen on the photograph I showed in the beginning. He was the second command of 5-1, the reconnaissance commando, and the Lieutenant de Koker during the operation. Now, during July and September, Christo was tasked to do a recce of the best route to approach the base. So he came across some information, and one thing is, right opposite to the road where the base was situated was a very large rural village west of the road. And this was also discovered from aerial photographs that was taken, when obviously interrogations of captured SWAPO soldiers added to information. So after all this information was received about the Central Aerial HQ, and then, interestingly, it was discovered that the Eastern Aerial HQ of SWAPO was also in a close proximity. So there are two very important bases, main frontal bases out of, I think, the 3 that SWAPO used in that area. So that was a very important target. It was realized. So the operation was now given a go-ahead by Harbour Command. They can proceed. At this point, Chris, I need to put 1 or 2 photographs on the screen, if you can just allow me a minute. Right. So, Chris, this map, this is the original map that was used in various headquarters, also in Sector 10. So just to show you, I showed the previous map. Here you have Kasinga, and then the main road going north. That's a village of Ndungo. And then if you travel a few kilometers, now I think each block course is about 10 kilometers. So 10, 15 kilometers north, you could get to that faint line there. I've got the ability to show you that in much better detail. So there's a thin line. Now, I'm not sure if that was intentional, but that was the road heading towards the base. Now you can see there's higher ground there. There's a few saunas around. There's a huge river quite far away. And obviously to the north, you've got the Benguela railway line. Now, Chris, this is very, very deep and very far into Angola. And you can see that the topography of the area, it's very flat, and it's a very high dense area. There are no features, very difficult to navigate. That's why you need very good information. Now, where are the SWAPO base? Now we can share two pictures. this is actually the map. It looks a little bit different. Sorry, the quality is not that good. From the previous map, this is the original operational map that was used by OPS Firewood. So here again, you've got the road going north, and just look at the block. There are 4 corners. So this 4 corners actually spans both sides of that main road going north. With the gravel road, the Teen Junction, the gravel road there shown going to the east. So this is the target area. Now, if we look at information that was gathered, and I managed to attend, before I completed my dissertation, 3 conferences that was held with the Recce's and 101 Battalion. And they used another map. Sorry, Chris, I just have to get that map for you. This one. So this is a map drawn of the setup. So here you've got the main road. You've got 1, 2, 3. I think there was a 4th low water bridge. Now this is just ditches. It's not really rivers, but they were a narrow. The road had to cross those ditches. So there's the gravel road that we saw, the arrows going there. So here was a plan. Now, Chris, I will show you shortly that this map is in various accounts not correct. There are more detailed maps available. And Chris, I mentioned in the beginning, I've got a few secrets to share with you today, which was never shared before. Which I'm willing to share with you. These are not even included in my book. And this have to do about exactly where this base was, and was it only one base, or were there more bases? So there's the base depicted. So let's just talk about the plan. So you have saunas on 3 sides: the north, the east, and the west. You have a road going towards the base. I think this is supposed to be the saunas. This is not according to scale. Now, so you've got the main force that will approach the base. So let's just refer to them. So in the middle, you've got the Casper. This is the plan of Sergeant Major James Tytge. He will be in the middle. He will be the first person to arrive at the assembly place where the formation will be formed. So to his left will be the 4 Caspers of 5-1 Recce Commando. That is the Koker and Rolfse. And then to Tytge's left, you will have the 4 Caspers of Major Jan Meyer. We've got people like Rijkaard, Gallen, and Edwards with him. The next is the Caspers of Buffels from 5-3 Recce Commando. Then you have the 8 Buffels, right about there, of the 1 Parachute Battalion Delta Company, the 1 company commander. You also saw his photograph, Lieutenant Johan Kruis, and then Captain Chris Wiese. And then to the far right, you will have 2 Recce in their 3 Buffels, Major Jan van der Merwe. And they would drive in an axle. The axle was supposed to be northwest to southeast. It's possible with the axle changed that it was actually totally vertically and not diagonal, in a diagonal fashion. Then, interesting, the plan was, while the main force attacked the base, 101 Battalion will separate in 4 different groups, easy, with 4 different companies. So you will have, if I have my bearings right, Chris, just give me a second. I think we'll get to that. So you'll have 1 company in this area, and there's a marsh, a dry marsh or a sauna. They will patrol in the east, in the north-south direction. One company will patrol in the north in the east-west direction. One company would patrol more or less on the road in the west and north-south direction, also taking care of a critical point there, that bridge, where they put a stopper group just to make sure any threat from the north is fended off. And then they had the last company, which I believe wasn't reserved, but it appears that they were also at the south, at this sauna. Now, SWAPO normally fortified their bases more to the south, because SWAPO always expected attacks to come from the south. For some reason, South Africa always avoid attacking from the south. They came from the north. In this case, they were even more relaxed. They used the main road. What surprise is that? But okay, so they will use the main road for the attack. So the purpose of 101 Battalion will be to serve as stopper groups. There will be cut-off groups. So what would the purpose be? Well, I think the main aim would be any SWAPers fleeing out of a base, that they then cut them off, and then they can score a few more kills. Because they are mobile, they can move quickly up and down and left and right. And more seriously, but I'm not sure if that was part of a plan, they will also be in a position to fend off any reaction force or any attack which other components of SWAPO could launch from the north. Right, so here you have got the layout of the base. We'll look at the maps later to show you how the movement took place. The main task force will not travel on the main road, 3.5 kilometers north of the village of Ndungo. They'll come on the main road, they follow the main road. The big village with the 200 huts was situated here. They will turn right at the T-junction and then follow the road. The assembly point, they will attack the base. Right, so this is a simple sketch of a base. And I can close this now so we can move on. Right, so let's talk about the attack. I referred to that village. The village was actually called Ilaula, where it had about 200 rural huts. On their approach, they actually noticed there were a presence of a lot of people in that village. So there was a little diversion. I think the call sign, it may be 10 of 101. They actually went to this village and they had a little bit of a confrontation where two SWAPO were killed. So there were SWAPO presence in that village, which was not really anticipated. Right, so they formed their medical post 3.5 kilometers west of the base, and there was an echelon where Koos Moorcroft was, and they had their tactical HQ where Colonel Hills and Skilly van der Walt from 1 Parachute Battalion and the head office components, I believe Stanley Batten was also there. So they were formed up. They had radio communication with higher command. So the higher command was either Brigadier Joep Joubert or the office command, Sector 10, Commandant Jap Swart. Now, they were either situated at the Sector 10 HQ at Oshikati, or it's possible that they could coordinate this operation from Fort Ref at Ndangwa, where Rekkies at their base. South of the base, they formed a helicopter admin area. Obviously, there would be needs to quickly evacuate shoulders. So they were able to insert helicopters. The helicopters would come from the tactical HQ at Yaoundé, where there was also a field hospital. Right, so I referred to the stopper groups. 1-0, Captain Koos Maritz, they were operating in the north. 3-0, Major Rademeyer, they were operating in the east. 4-0, from Van Niekerk, they were operating in the west, near the road. And then what I believe was the reserve, or more focused on the south, was Prinsloo 2-0. So those were the components, as I showed on the map. So they were not part of a main force. I showed you who the main force was and where they attacked. So, Chris, H-hour for the attack was then scheduled for 12 o'clock. That's midday. Now, the task force left a temporary base about an hour's drive away from the target where they stayed overnight. At about 2 o'clock on the 31st of October. Now, interesting, of course, at that night, you won't believe it, Maritz surprised a few of his friends. He actually presented them with a bottle sealed with real Jamaican red hot rum. Now, you can just imagine how pleased those guys were. So they had their little party on the 30th of October, drinking away their problems, perhaps having some leisure time, and perhaps for a few it was a sentimental occasion. So they actually were in high spirit after at least tasting a bit of a good stuff. The next day when they approached the target, it appeared that some of 101 soldiers suffered from what we refer in army terms as Jippo guts, that is gastroenteritis. Now, that is when your stomach gets really upset. There was no time to stop, so this guy's actually just opened the back doors and they hang out of the Casper, and that is how they actually released themselves, to the amusement, I'm sure, of everybody on board. It was quite a joke. So the guys were in high spirit before the attack. So approaching the target was a stop-start affair. They didn't travel on the road. They have to get past the village at Ndungo, not to be discovered. There were a lot of breakdowns. Now, of course, you should understand, they already traveled in the extent of 200, 300 kilometers. This is bush breaking, hard drive. There were no roads. So those vehicles, the Caspers took a severe hammering. Don't even imagine what the Buffels did. It is a very difficult convoy to be in, driving for days and days. I experienced some of it in my time, and I believe you, it's not pleasant. So they had a few breakdowns, and they were recovered, but at the end, they actually managed to get past that, and they were on their way. So south of the target, they actually come across a deserted gas, it's a Soviet truck, which was standing next to the road, which they went past, and they actually nearing the target. So they came on the main road. At the T-junction, there was the gravel road that goes towards the enemy base. They turned right, and they're now heading towards the enemy base. So the first person to arrive at the assembly point was Sergeant Major James Tytger. And when he stopped, he only had 3 Caspers with him. The remainder of his force did not arrive, and there was a bit of a radio problem. Now, let me explain what was the hold-up for this. Now, of course, as they approached the T-junction, you won't believe me, some of the convoy guys, while turning right, I'm sure they even put on the indicators showing that they're turning right at the junction. Traffic was coming from the north, Chris. What's the truck? A Ural so wet truck coming on the road from a noise, and very casually asked permission to join the convoy. They stopped and they allowed him to form part of the enemy convoy, and they were leisurely traveling along this road towards the target. At some point in time, the three on board this vehicle, they saw that things are not fine. I believe when the first aerial attack took place and there were smoke and bombs exploding, they became uncertain of where they actually found themselves. But this situation was quickly sorted out. Then I think Koos Verwy actually took out this vehicle. It was engulfed in flames, and I believe the three on board escaped. But that held up the convoy for a while. So there was a gap opening while this was taking place before we get to the site. So I refer back to H hour 12 hours. The day they had clear skies. It was excellent weather. It was a perfect day to have a fight. So H hour, the attack started with an air-to-surface bombardment, and the South African Air Force used for this purpose 8 Mirage F1A2s. They were fighter jets, and they had on board 6 Mk81 bombs, which they dropped on the target. And there were also 2 Impalas overhead. Now, it's important, if there were any critical installations like the Swapper used to have their 40.5 and 23 millimeter anti-aircraft guns. Now, these guns were used on the ground roll, which was actually very, very difficult in any operation. So they had to sort out these positions. But the turnaround time for this aircraft course was very short because of the long distances. So they stayed on the target for a very short time. They had to turn around and head back to base for refueling. Now, there is a report that later that day, the Impalas did come back, but they couldn't launch an attack because at that stage, the task force was already inside the target and there was not opportunity. There could have been friendly casualties from that attack. So that attack didn't take place, but for the remainder, there were no air cover during the attack, which is quite important to know that if you have Alouette gunships, they were not available. At least you've got some observation from overhead that was not available to the task force. I explained to you how they lined up the force, and then, of course, it was time to start with the main force for the attack. And you know, when attack started, the order is given on the radio, and with a lot of shouting, all battle stations forward, which is a sign to move on. So they were in their positions. Now, this force was still in their vehicles. So they're moving forward in their vehicles. And the question I always ask myself, and I've got a very valuable photograph. I had to pick a certain person's brains, if I can just show this photograph. Because you probably recognize him. Just opening up. Right. This is Colonel Jan Breitenbach with his lovely wife. I had an interview with him. You see the nice refreshments that he offered me in Pretoria. Now, he's perhaps the icon of a border war. He was with the Parabats, with the Rekkies, with 3 Battalion. His legacy is everlasting. And I had quite a discussion with him. And in my book, I included his account on when to have a protection of armored vehicles and when to debus. So that is an important question to ask. And it appears this force didn't debus from their vehicles. So They were moving forward in a straight line. Now, you should understand it's dense bush. There's vegetation. It's almost impossible to keep your line. So there was a lot of disruption and confusion. And at some point, I believe the parabatch swapped places with a 2 recce. So the parabatch was actually on the far right, and that's also important for this operation. So as I move forward, the parabatch in the southeast was the first to make contact. They drew the first fire, and then was all hell broke loose. It was a fierce battle with lots of dust, cloud, and smoke, and lots of noise. The typical fire force battle that you experience in all these battles. So they were facing a variety of small arms, RPG-7 rockets, B-10, 120mm recoilless rockets and guns, all was aimed at them. So there was an area cleared to serve as an indication that that is where the enemy would find themselves. So the first parabatch debussed from their vehicle, and at this point in time, we had this first guy who was killed, a parabat, Corporal Olivier, 19 years of age. He died from a wound while he was debussing the buffle. So now they were off their vehicles. In the confusion, a buffle reversed, and this buffle drove over a soldier. So I think he broke his pelvis as a result of that. Right. So now the parabats had their first engagement. Let's move to second recce, because they were next to the parabats. And you already covered that account from Daryl and Greg, Chris. They were traveling in the 2 or 3 buffles. They had the wrinkles with them. And as they're nearing the target area, it appears that either a B-10 recoilless gun, I take account and I include my book, more likely that Daryl said that it was a airburst from an 82mm mortar bursted above the buffalo, and 12 of their soldiers, they had only 19 members, almost half their component was wounded in that one airburst, and they had to be recovered. Now, they share an account of one of the Wrinkles vehicles that got lost and actually came on this road, and that Wrinkles drove right into the enemy base, attracted a lot of fire, and turned around. The same account was shared by Chris Snyman, that he and Chris Skutte was actually the vehicle that drove into that base. So I actually accept Chris Snyman's account, because that is supported by more evidence that in that confusion, there was actually a Casper driving into the base, making a U-turn and getting out of the base, unscathed. It's a miracle. So 2 recces guys, really, they had a serious incident there. Now, let's focus on the guys on the 8 rattles and the buffles from the recces. So they debussed from their Caspers. The Caspers are armed with their medium cannons, variety of 3.0 Browning, 5.0 Browning, and there was a 20mm. I think James Tytge had that one fitted. So this Caspers were giving them firing support, and at some stage they had to stop because the guys were moving closer to the target. So it was fire control. They were moving an extended line. I was told that the parabats expanded over an area of 500 meters. Now, if you added the recces, I'm sure this line was quite long. You can do your calculations. It must have been more than 1 or 2 kilometers that this extended line went forward. I may be wrong. Now, they had on them their battle jackets, so they had only their primary equipment, extra water, ammunition, and their provisions with them. So they were not carrying much weight. So they were moving in the straight line. I understand the platoon commander shouting orders, giving them directions, getting them to stay in line, getting them to move forward, not to hesitate. They were doing this leapfrog movement course where one part moved forward while they got a firing support, and then they do the same with the rest. So they're moving through this area. They started to attracting fire from the enemy, and then at some point they reached a clear sign at the base, and that is where they came across the trenches that was around the base. So back to the parabats, they went past this open area. They came over at the area where was something like a parade ground, so they didn't have a lot of cover. So the second person that was killed was Lance Corporal Light, also 21 years old. He died there from a chest wound, and then course within an hour, 4 more parabats, Rose, Evels, Schemon 21, and Van Rooyen also were killed. One of them had a phosphorus grenade on his webbing, and that grenade exploded, and that incriminated his body. It was not a good sight to come across. So let's move back to the recce's. So the recce's come across the trenches. So the drills, which they practiced over and over again at Oshivallo, was standard. So you come to a section of the trenches, you throw a hand grenade in the trench, it explodes to get that shock effect. 2 soldiers jumped into the trench, one shoot to the left, other one shoot to the right, and the whole thing gets repeated over and over again. The whole time fighting the enemy, trying to clear the trenches. So there were a whole long trenches covering the area, and they were underground bunkers. They also had to clear the bunkers. Every time there was a need for support, somebody got wounded, they would throw a red smoke to attract the rinkels, to get the medics to assist them, but that smoke actually had the opposite effect. Then they actually attracted more fire. Now, during their movement, they received a lot of firing from the RPG-7s, and also SWAPO had the 81mm mortars, firing in a proper firing plan. Now, what's interesting at this point in time, you should ask the question, Chris. So where were the task force mortars? You had the 4 Ratels with their mortar pipes. Why didn't they come into action? And I would explain this a bit later, but there was a crisis taking place at that spot. So they didn't get the proper support. So not only was there no artillery to soften the target ahead of them, the fire support of 81mm mortars at that stage was non-existent. There was reports that there were MiGs aeroplanes in the area, and that there was actually more trouble that was to come. So they managed to, with a great deal of fighting, the fighting continued in extent of 4 hours. Now, of course, 4 hours fighting is a major fight, but it's not simple. So there were a big component of SWAPO in the base. There was even reports that some of these weapons were manned by female soldiers, which they also came across. So around about 1600 hours, the recce's and the main force managed to go through the target area, and they were then supported by some of the vehicles from 101, but also did a final sweep of a base. So that part of operation went as planned, exception with the parabats that lost 6 soldiers, but and the 2 recce's had wounded. It was a successful fight. I think the way they behaved and they conducted the fight was excellent. That was really, I need to compliment those forces for their preparation, their discipline, and the vigor at which they attacked this base, and they managed to go through this base. So at 1600 hours, they received instructions to withdraw from the target area. So the main force was starting to withdraw. There was a report that there were more bases of SWAP in the area. As I mentioned earlier, the eastern area HQ was also in the area about 5 kilometers to the north. Now, the body count at its base, now you can challenge this and you can say, but how do you know how many people were killed? Now, let me tell you, a soldier in battle, when he came across the enemy and there's a close firefight, he's got a vivid recollection on what happened in his area. You don't know what happened in the remainder. That's why it's difficult sometimes to gather the story and actually compile the whole operation, because a soldier knows exactly what's happening in front of him, but not necessarily on his side. So from that information, they gather that SWAPO head count of people killed were between 100, 150, with maybe as high as 200 soldiers killed at that base. So let's just talk about the Rattles. The Rattles was supposed to commence with the firing when the attack commenced. The Rattles had to set their charges. Now, I'm sure during their rehearsals, they should know exactly what charge they should use, what direction, and how they should do their firing plan. But during this confusion, they had to change the charges. And one of the Rattle where Jan Steenkamp was, they just disposed of the charges on the floor of a Rattle. So there were a lot of charges on the floor. I understand these charges should be properly discharged in a separate container. And from a spark, one of these charges was ignited and the whole Rattle was engulfed in flame. And Jan Steenkamp, he spent a lot of time in hospital with severe burns. He actually was cured and recovered from that. So that perhaps is an indication why that critical time the mortars didn't fire and come into action. So that concludes the attack on the main base at the target north of Ndungu. So at around 1600 hours, 1630, they were withdrawing from a base, and it appears that the objective was reached. But Koos, that was not so. Now let's turn our attention then to 101 Battalion. Remember, they were the guys forming the cordon. And for this purpose, Koos, I need to share those notes with you. And I'm pleased to say you're perhaps the first person who I share this with. Because this is part of one of the reports that was presented. So this is just an excerpt. I didn't put in the whole page. So the 101 reports after the operation, and this sketch was drawn, and it's quite a detailed sketch. So to complement the previous sketch, and remember I showed you that block of that map with the 4 corners. It appears that this is perhaps that part. So you have a main road and the trench system, but just look at this map. It's quite different from the sketch I showed to you, because this depicts that the the target was actually on both sides on the road. Now this would be the village, but look there are trenches all around. And these trenches are mainly in the south. So there you have a gravel road. This sketch is also not 100% because it actually cut off. We can't see where the base is, but this is how 101 saw that operation, which is a bit different. But let's for a moment pause there. More importantly, here's the sauna. More importantly, I'm going to turn to this one, is the area north of the base. So you probably have that access road. It's not shown on this map. It may be the base area here. It's not certain, but you've got the sauna north of the base, and then there were more saunas. Remember, we had these bridges over these ditches. So what is depicted on this map is not the target area, but these appears to be more targets and more enemy bases. So you had one just north of a sauna. They say there is fortified positions here. So there were a lot of enemy, and this was 150 enemy in this place. You had another one with 30 enemy, a fortified position there and there. This is a high lying ground, both of these. There are train system there. There's an enemy base of 40 swapus, and then there on the right of the road is, I think it's a 30 enemy on that base. So we can try to enlarge it. So I think the main problem was from that area, Chris, and then perhaps from this large component of enemy we have there. Let me just open it like that. So it's that area. So remember, they were patrolling in the north. They're patrolling in the north. Okay. So the 101 battalion guys were actually covering the fight in the south and not familiar with what's happening in the north. And then we can move on to the next one. It's the same picture with more detail. Now, it's difficult to 100% understand the arrows and the movement because the arrows show different platoons or teams of the Romeo mics of 101. 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 1, 3. Okay, so you've got all of it. So there you've got the 40 enemy, the 30 enemy, there's the 100 there, and then the smaller groups there. Right. Okay, Chris. So from this picture, and I'm going to stay on this picture for a while, if you allow me, we can gather what happened after 1600 hours when the main target was in fact already finalized, the attack. Right, so Chris, I'm going to give a bit of detail. So what I'm going to explain to you are two separate ambushes that were set for components of 101 battalion. And then I'm going to explain to you how reinforcements were sent to this hotspot areas. And there were 4 or 5 enforcement sets to the areas. Remember the guys in the Caspers, Erection Force, and how they engaged in this area. So it was already late that day. I believe call sign 32 and 32 Charlie. Now, these are the call signs from Bok and Stander. Now, I'll use a lot of names, but we'll get to a point. They found themselves in this area. I'm sure perhaps they were securing that bridgehead there, not 100%, but they were driving this area. So there were 2 Caspers, and they were part of Rademeyer's company, 30, what was supposed to cover the eastern perimeter of a base. So it's more to the south, but they would have drive there up and down. There's 3-1 and 3-3. So they found themselves in that area, and they drove into a Swapo ambush. So they were ambushed, properly SWAPO from these bases. And a big firefight took place. SWAPO with the anti-tank teams, heavily armed with RPG-7s, even the disposable RPG-74, a relatively new weapon, B-10s, mortars, anything they can throw at them. And remember, SWAPO had experience a year before at Colosseum. I explained to you where they set to ambushes. So SWAPO was starting to devise a method to neutralize a reaction force such as 101 Battalion. And 101 Battalion, two of their platoons drove right into an ambush. So there was a big firefight. A lot of soldiers from Bok and Stander were wounded. A number of soldiers fled the scene. They ran for safety to get to safer area, while Bok and Stander continued to fire with their machine guns to try to safeguard their wounded soldiers. So there were serious fights going on. So they were calling for reinforcements. Remember, I'm telling you with the sequence how this fight is taking place. So the first reinforcements, of course, I hope power is going to last, but we will just reconnect if there's a problem. So the next force to arrive is call sign 3033. Now that was Rademeyer. Rademeyer was the major or captain. He was right. Maybe proceed. There's just a power failure. Of course, yes, I referred to the first map, and then we turned to the second map, and we are now focusing on this area where I said Bok and Stander was in the first ambush. And then from here, we had, sorry, let me just get that. We had Rademeyer moving towards Bok. So they were moving into that direction to as reinforcements and to assist them. And because you have this component of SWAPO, so they were driving in a sauna. It might have been this sauna or this one, I'm not sure, in an extended line formation. So they were ready to face any threat of the enemy. But there was an obstacle in front of them. They had to form in a single line again. And as they passed this obstacle, of course, they got into a serious ambush. So that was even a bigger fight than the first one. So now we have a second ambush. And Rademeyer, he had 16, maybe 16 minus 2. Ratels were with him. They were a big force, but they come under a serious attack. So with Rademeyer and Botes was a Lieutenant Cobalt. He was also from the Rekkies, and he got on his radio and he seriously called for help. And he said something in the words, "Help, they are killing us, they are killing us." And this was recorded at the tactical HQ. So now the plans was put into motion on how to deal with the situation, because there was a different fight from what was anticipated taking place on two areas north of the target. So various components of 101 Battalion was sent as reinforcements, and I will try to make it as clear as possible. So you had the cars, and let's talk about the Caspers as cars. You had the cars of Prinsloo and Tennyson. They were from call sign 42, and also they were call sign 20. With them was Vickers Cronje and Maritz. So they were the first to be dispatched, and they were sent. So if we say they were sent 4-2, it may be this line that we have here because there's 4-2. So they were heading towards that contact. When they near the contact, they were engaged in a fight and Marius was seriously wounded. And Prince decided to turn around, go south, take Marius to the medical post, and that action probably saved Marius's life. So on their way to the target, they came across a base. It may be one of these bases. They engaged in a firefight, and here a B-14 enemy vehicle was shot out. So they had their own separate engagement. Also sent now to aid Rademeyer's people in this area was call sign 11. Now 11 is perhaps this line, maybe. So they approached the area at high speed. Now this is an interesting account that we receive actually from Cronje. Cronje was actually with Prinsloo on this side. While they were drying, Swapo in the area approached the moving vehicles. They jumped on the sides of these cars, trying to open the back door. And if they would have succeeded, throwing a hand grenade into the car and that way sort out the car. That is how close this firefight was. They didn't succeed in doing that. So back at Blighnout, when he arrived at that area about 50 meters from where Rademeyer's positions was, he was firing with his 5.0 Browning, and his Browning received a direct hit from a rocket, rendering his weapon unusable. He was wounded in his right arm, and Stein, that was him. When the rocket strike or another rocket, he was killed there with a Blighnout. Blighnout was wounded. Blighnout managed to continue to fire with his other usable arm, and he was trying to get away from his car to go to the position where Botus was. And now, of course, this is where the serious part of this operation took place. There in the middle of this terrible, terrible fight with all sorts of rockets exploding and a lot of enemy, superior in numbers and all means, we found the positions of Botus and Rademeyer. And now let's explain what happened there. So Botus's car was standing there, unable to move. The tires were flat because of the firing. And with a direct rocket hit, Botus's car was engulfed in flames. Botus managed to jump out of the car. He fell on the ground, and as he laid there, because of the heat, he was also incriminated next to his car. So Botus unfortunately died there. We have an account from another member, Dave Drew, and his recollection was Cobalt, Lieutenant Cobalt Verrecki. Remember, he was the guy on the radio shouting for help. So Cobalt's Casper was also standing there, and his Casper received a direct hit from a B-10 Recolloy's gun, which struck him right on the front window. And there Cobalt was killed instantly. And then the third rattle, a car, Casper from Rademeyer, his vehicle was knocked out. So after a while, after the firing died down, they were looking for Rademeyer, and they discovered the body of Rademeyer. Rademeyer actually ran away from his vehicle. He was under a large bush. His one arm was severed from his body, so he continued to fend off the approaching Swapoos with his other arm, shooting at them. And there they discovered the body of Boertes. He was lying with a pile of spent cartridges next to him, indicating that a serious fight was taking place there. So that was the unfortunate fate of those 3 or 4 people. So the next to arrive, remember the people arrived in sections, and the next to arrive in support of Rademacher was 1-1 Charlie, perhaps also in this area, and this was a Bronkhorst, and Fellows Smith, he was call sign 1-3. So they arrived there, it was chaos. There were enemy everywhere. So they were driving at high speed with their vehicle, and they came across a group of 7 Swapoos in front of them. And they just managed to ram their car right into the Swapoos. And they crashed and smashed these Swapoos, and with their big wheels, they pulverized the Swapoos underneath, killing 7 Swapoos. Here, also Badenhorst was wounded with a wound in his arm. Right, so with him was Fella Smith. Now, Fella, who was with Badenhorst, he got struck by perhaps an RPG or something, and his gunner and his driver was killed instantly. A fella managed to escape, and he also fled the scene. Right, so now we've got the 3rd or 4th reinforcement to arrive, almost suffering the same fate, having to deal with this Swapo threat. So the next is we can draw our attention to another section of 101 that was also tasked to give assistance. So again, the name of Prinsloo, remember he was actually evacuating Maritz. He was driving alongside the main road in this area north. They were driving with Snyman, Skittend van Niekerk in extended line formation with their cars. So we're driving north, and as we reach a base, they were attacked, and the convoy started to make a sharp right turn to cross this road. But for some reason, in the chaos, Tennyson didn't notice that the rest of his group was separated from me. So he continued straight on. He came across an enemy truck which eliminated, and then had to turn around, come back and meet up with his group again. And at the end, I will tell you that he received a Norris Crooks for a report about that incident. So there was huge fighting, more and more people arriving, and at some stage, because it was getting dark, the fighting started to die down, and 101 was able to start with the mopping up and the clearing of this operation. So, of course, yes, that was a firefight with at a huge loss, tremendous cost. And one can perhaps imagine SWAPO with the anti-tank platoons, they were ready for this force. They were well organized. And you can imagine Casper is not a match for RPG-7 rockets. And they were under severe danger. And that is why this horrific incident took place, which contributed to the large number of casualties, as I mentioned in the beginning. So I think the mopping up, so there were a lot of vehicles stranded, left abandoned. Some of the vehicles were burning fiercely. Perhaps I can just show you a photograph, and if I can just page through my records. Okay, can I just show this record? This is a record of an enemy base, giving you an idea of a vegetation. There's a few buildings there. So this is typically how the area looked like, but the photograph I need to share with you is this very important photograph. So you can see it is twilight. There you have got the vehicle fiercely burning. We would assume that is either Rademacher or Advertise's vehicle. So that vehicle was destroyed. And this vehicle seems to be intact. Looked at the tires and the damage to it. And we believe this vehicle is Stander's vehicle. And then the third vehicle, which is not on the photograph of Rademacher or Advertise, is also somewhere in this area. So this is a photograph of a scene where this attack takes place. It is really a very special material to have as part of this presentation. So the clearing was taking place, and the mopping up, and the force was able, okay, at that point in time, I must just mention, under the direction of the Asserville, the mortars, 81 mortars, do come into operation. They fired on the enemy, and perhaps that may have an effect on the enemy disengaging that firefight. Okay, so of course, there was a mopping up that needed to do. They had to find their wounded soldiers. They had to gather all the fleeing soldiers. Among them also Stander, he was missing. They had to try and find him. So and a number of vehicles were lost. We had a Badenhorst. He also suffered a bullet wound in his stomach. So there were a lot of injured guys who needed attention. So the mopping up entailed that they had to fix the vehicles, replace the tires, a lot of work, and they managed to recover 9 cars. Just to show you the extent of the damage that was caused on those 2 areas. But still, Rademacher, Advertise, and Stander's vehicles, for once I showed in the photograph. Well, somebody took the photograph. Somebody should have known where they are. But in the confusion, that location was not properly recorded, which is quite a mystery to me. But in battle, you understand that happens. They managed to take all the vehicles except the few that left behind to a assembly area, where they had a little bit of a roll call, see who are present, discovered there are a few people not there. At that point in time, 3 of the soldiers, perhaps the drivers, the people, as I mentioned, they were not accounted for. So 3 bodies were not returned after this firefight. Now, just a note here, the next day, on the 1st of November, because 3 vehicles were left behind, I received a report in the archives where the South African Air Force actually dispatched some of their fighter jets, and as an air-to-surface attack was launched on these vehicles. Probably successful. They destroyed at least 2 of these vehicles. But I need to share this with you, Chris. We have archival footage. This is a photograph of the vehicle of, I believe, Stander, that was captured. You see the front window is missing, but it's got tires. So it was fairly intact. And then at the back, you'll see there's a buffle. And we will get to that soon. So there's just another, I'm shooting some of SWAPO Cubans standing next to this vehicle. So that was quite a discovery and a price. and they used this obviously to their advantage. Right, so there are the vehicles. So late at night at about 8 o'clock, they started the vehicles. Some of the convoys in groups already exited the area, and as they started their vehicles, they made noise. SWAPO was again ready. So another bombardment with their mortars, and they actually were a coordinated attack. It was a fire plan with a volley of mortars exploding in a line, moving closer, moving closer, moving closer. And they had SWAPO on the hills. So the last part of the convoy left. One of the convoys, and a reference was made, I believe, by Stanley Batten, but they actually had some form of a very unsophisticated GPS system, a guidance system. So one of the convoy followed the system, and they actually did a full circle, and they ended up where they started because they was following the system. So there was quite a lot of confusion. One of the drivers, when he had to turn left at a certain junction, he turned right and he was heading towards the enemy, and they had to get him to stop and come back. So there's a lot of confusion, and they had this attack. So one of the biffles, I believe it was a biffle of the Parabats, as Daryl and Greg alerted to the fact it was not two Recce's biffle, drove into a ditch. It overturned. But in the confusion and the haste, they boarded other vehicles and they left that biffle there with all its equipment. Just indication of the urgency of these convoys leaving that area. And that biffle was discovered, and that's the one we also see on the photograph. So a total of 4 vehicles was left at the scene. Now, that is really unique. The Defence Force seldom, and in one of my articles I published, I mentioned in the whole war, not more than 15 to 20 South African vehicles are still inside Angola on this day, which were either left behind because of serious fights. And you can read the article if you need more information. But at this location, we had 4 vehicles lost. So, Koos, to continue, so the wounded soldiers were evacuated to the helicopter admin area. 3 helicopters arrived, and these wounded soldiers were actually evacuated. So they arrived at the temporary base about 2 o'clock that morning, and they broke up camp again at sunrise, and they left and drove to the south, where they received more orders. Now, at the end, when the head count was done, it was discovered that during that fighting, the task force lost 15 soldiers, which is equal to the highest number on any given day compared to operations of Savati, the helicopter that was shot down in 1982. But the number of wounded, there were 56 soldiers wounded with all sorts of wounds, shrapnel wounds, broken legs, bones, everything you can think of, which is quite a high number. So they moved south. They received orders to join the operations, Operation Daffodil, that was taking place in the Kuvala area. By that time, you can just imagine the state of their equipment. They led a group with a number of people killed who were not there. So I believe that force was a stricken force at that point in time. So 14 days later, they were part of that operation. There they received necessary replenish of ammunition and provisions. And there was a bit of action taking place. Mention was also made to that by Stanley Batten. So on the 14th of November at about 9 o'clock, a South African Air Force Impala was doing a airstrike on an enemy target. The pilot was Captain Andre Strapa. And Andre Strapa lost control of the Impala, and the Impala actually hit the ground, and he was also killed instantly in that crash. So more operations continued to the north of Onjiva. There were Rakis deployed on the road between Onjiva, Mongua, and Zongongu. And soon thereafter, 101 and the Parabats, they left the area and they went back to bases. So at the end, 5 members of 101 Battalion was actually honored. They received the Distinguished Honoris Cook's Medal, and they were Tennyson, you will recognize the names, Bok, Barnhorst, Prinsloo, and Stander. So that was the fight. So I don't want to leave you here. There were a conference, a nabetrachting, which was done after this incident. It was actually in March the next year. So this conference was held by Brigadier Westbier. So they discussed this operation, and a few remarks is contained in that report. It's also primary source. So I perhaps need to share just a few points. There are many more. You'll find it in the book. But they recognized the long distances that these vehicles had to travel to reach the target was extraordinary. And that was something that really played a big part in the operation. The lack of, obviously, I mentioned fire support by artillery pieces, and the limited effect the 81 millimeters had during the operation. And they should have actually followed the advice by Colonel Eddie Viljoen to supplement them with heavier vehicles. Right, so they regarded the operation as a success. I think the main target they recognized was taken, the central areas headquarters of SWAPO, which is a major achievement. It was eliminated. So SWAPO's next infiltration, when rainy season starts, that's normally between December and April, when the conditions is right for the infiltrations, that was hampered because SWAPO had to move back. Their forward detachments were destroyed, so they had to travel over 300 kilometers, mostly on foot, to get to Southwest Africa. So the SWAPO at that point was reduced. They were not the shadow of a SWAPO they were early in the war, let's say around about 1978, 79. The next thing, it was recorded that the vehicles that was abandoned and left behind, and the tactics used by 101 Battalion and the operational methods. And there was just one word mentioned at the conference, and they said that was highly dangerous, because they are taking too big deal of a risk, especially in this type of operation. We're not talking about aerial operations. We're talking operation where you actually apprehend a very strong base. So to conclude this part, I need to mention a few things. I came across records. The peers what also contributed to 101's position is they deployed during the operation. I already mentioned they didn't have their preferred equipment, but they also had new recruits, raw recruits with them because the core of their force was, as I explained, used elsewhere at Operation Modular. So these recruits were perhaps not that well trained. It's obvious that the task force didn't operate as units. One would expect if a task force go in, that should be contingency plans in the event that certain things went wrong. Why do you have soldiers in reserve? Why wasn't there a proper contingency plan to fend off the enemy attack? And that appears not to have existed. Obviously, I repeat, the SWAPO anti-tank teams were very effective, especially against a mobile force like this. Not having the Air Force available was a problem. The turnaround time was limited, but there was the risk of a mix in the area. And I must just, at this point in time, there's a report that on the 2nd of November, FAPLA did send the mix. The mix attacked the positions at Mupa, and during that airstrike, 5 Defence Force soldiers were injured. So the mix were afraid, and for that reason, you cannot expect that you can have alouettes, gunships overhead, when we experienced in the past. And really, dealing with all my research and all the operations, I must admit, there are special operations. You extensively dealt with Savati, you dealt with Ops Super. Those were exceptional operations. Forte come to mind, and many, many more. There are 20 of them. But I must admit, for various reasons, Operation Firewood is perhaps one of those operations in the war that actually stand out from the rest. For good reasons and also for bad reasons. So just to conclude, so the war, and that is my final say, the war continued in the east at the Mvinga area until April 1988, where there was a stalemate and not a victory to any side. That is the rubbish that we hear, and that our children are fed in their school books. But I'm not going to deal with that. You'll probably have adequately equipped people with knowledge about that. You can find that in my book. And then at the west, there at the Tetepa, Kaluek area, those fighting, the Cubans approached the border with the tanks. That was resolved. The G5 houses did play their part. So that fighting died down on the 26th of June 1988. And then the peace accord was struck. The final peace was signed on the 22nd of December 1988. And then obviously SWAPO wanted to have a last say the first week in April 89, when they broke all accords and they tried to pick a fight, and there were big fighting taking place, loss of a lot of lives. And that was the end of the war. And just a final remark, Fidel Castro was actually the mastermind behind this whole war. In total dismay on how the war was fought, he had his general, the commander of the Cuban forces, General Ocua Sanchez, and he was the commander since November 1987. He had his general executed, which execution took place on the 12th of July 1989. I'm sure you will not find a monument or a huge headstone for the head of his army. So that was the end of the war. And I think at this point in time, because this concludes this part of my story. I thank you for the opportunity.
Well, Marius, we have to thank you, because I can tell you this was one of the most fascinating 2.5 hours of my life. I'm quite sure many, many others. What happened to that fellow who drove north, who kept going? The one who wanted to murder crooks? I think you You were about to tell us about that, and then Eskom got us from behind. And
Yeah,
he
no,
turned around and he came back.
Yeah, I think that was at Prinsloo. Let me just check. Yes, he was with Snyman and Skutte. He entered that firefight with his car, and he engaged with the firefight as if he had support with his colleagues, but he was on his own. So he had a miraculous escape, because after he did what he's supposed to do, he actually hit a vehicle which was eliminated. He actually escaped and left. And his act was a brave act, and for that he deserved the Marius Scheepers, I'm sure of that.
We had a lot of comments when the Firewood ops came out with Greg Ashton and Daryl O'Kelly. And as luck would have it, we actually recorded Greg Ashton's story as a reconnaissance member. And we have it available, and then of course came Colonel Stanley F. Botten. It seems to me people want to blame Colonel Hills. Now, Colonel Hills, as far as I know, is a fantastic officer. Paratrooper, I think he became a commander of one recce. Now, I have to ask you the hard question here. And I've not gotten hold of Colonel Hills. He's in New Zealand. To ask him his opinion, I've tried to reach out to him. Who made that decision to refuse the rocket launchers, the Valkyries? Because they could have made a difference there. In fact, it's strange to me that they were not there. Who made that decision? Was it Colonel Hills or someone else?
Yeah. Well, Chris, during the talk of Daryl and Greg, they had a very interesting information about what happened at the training area at Umatea. And from their recollection, there seems to me that everything was not in order. And they had a lot of criticism. You can listen to that part. I'm sure, assume higher command, Brigadier Frank Bespier, it was within his power. Perhaps the fact that there was a serious threat in the east. The second war was taking place, so don't take away from that. And for all sorts of reasons, I think the Defence Force went into Firewood not 100% prepared. And could you blame officer in command? You mentioned Colonel James Hills. I've got tremendous respect for him. In my records, I come across his name. He was at Ops Savannah. He was a captain there, playing a major role. I came across his name in Protea. He was there a task group commander. He went through the ranks, became the officer command of the recces. So he was specialized. I do believe the South African Defence Force displayed a bit of, and I may say this, arrogance. The way they approached this target. I think they actually didn't expect much to happen. Having a cordon formed by 101 Battalion is also unique. Normally when you attack the base, when the enemy fled, you have a follow-up operation. You don't box them in. And if you box them in, the stopper groups are not on vehicles. You don't have vehicles driving around near a target. Perhaps 101 Battalion, they were a reaction force, and they've proven that they are capable of doing this. You can judge for yourself whether that approach in an operation like this was successful. If you talk to anyone from other infantry units, 32 Battalion, or I assume the Parabats, they will look at this and they will say, but that is not our method of operation. It is foreign to what they know of. But remember, Reaction Force had a lot of successes. That is why General Meyring believed they were a unique unit. But to come back to Hills, yes, I think the force didn't operate in unit. I mentioned that before. Because he was an officer in command, I would expect that the contingency planning would have been done. especially where they already had experience the year before at Colosseum. But I don't want to criticize James Hills. I think he's, in my book, of course, I listed the 50 persons during the Angolan border war that played an important part. It is in the book, and I do honor and I list Colonel James Hills also as one of, I think, the officers or soldiers that distinguished themselves during the war.
I've heard a story. In fact, it was told to me off the record, so I'm not going to mention the officer's name, who said to me that one of the paratrooper companies were virtually without their leader element. In fact, they did not have their platoon leaders with them. I don't know if it's true or not, so I'm asking you now, have you found out anything about that? I believe it was Delta Company, but I might be wrong. And if anybody knows about it, please tell me.
No, I beg to differ. I also had interviews with Johan Kreis. He was an officer, a very esteemed officer. He was in command of one platoon. I think Lisa was in command of a second platoon. So they had platoon leaders, and Johan and Visa was with their soldiers. They were right there at the front. They were giving directions. And the parabats, they are a unique bunch. I mean, those guys are thoroughly trained. And I don't believe that that you would have any difficulties on their side. So no, I think because the parabats had the most soldiers who were killed, that is because they were actually at the hot spot. They were at the most difficult part of operation. And that's just what happened during these kind of operations.
Yes, our intention here is not to point fingers. We're talking back now about more than 40 years, and perhaps some young officer or someone can listen here and understand perhaps more. I have to say we've got hold of a doctor, PhD guy, Colonel Nelson, Alan Nelson. He was on the G5 and G6 program, and he's going to talk to us soon. I really hope. But I think that is. May I ask you if you have a few last observations about Firewood before I'm going to ask you what you're doing now? What happened to you after you left 32 Battalion and you became, I suppose, an attorney? And I know you married very well. You married a wonderful woman. I've heard about her, the professor. Please give my regards to her as well.
Thank you. Yeah, of course. Yes, so this operation was the last occasion a South African task force actually entered a SWAPO base. That is unique. And then I think at that stage, the war was over due to economics. I mean, Cuba couldn't afford the war. The Soviet Union was dissolving. The Berlin Wall fell in the 11th of November, I think, is it 1989? At the end of the Soviet Union on the 25th of December. Cuba was without support, and South Africa was at severe sanctions. So the logic was to strike an accord, and truth was. Now, just a last remark, I got a message, you know, a lot is made about the win, the so-called the war was won at Kutu Carnival. Now, you should understand that is so far from the truth. This kind of wars, it is a guerrilla war, it is they are rebels. Nobody in the modern age declared war. It didn't happen. At the end of a war, you don't have this triumphant march through the main streets where people are paraded through the streets and the person gets a crown that's put on his head. And now you've got the victory and the war was over. The war was over because the opposing forces choose to end the war through an accord. Namibia became independent 1 or 2 years later. Now, the revolutionary force had to participate in a democratic election. They won the election and they were the ruling party in Namibia. Now, the record will show you, Chris, all liberation struggles in Africa. The revolution force, when the struggle was over after colonization, they actually, if there was an election, they actually won the election. So the war was ended through the ballot box and negotiations, and not by one force scoring a victory over another force. So I think that's a final say, and we don't need to say more. On a personal note, Chris, thank you for that. I need to be brief. We have already been a while. So after my national service, I studied, as you mentioned, at the University of Orange Free State. It's always also your alma mater. Chris, you are also an attorney. You probably did the same courses. I know you did the B Juris LLB. I did the B Proc LLB. It's more or less the same. So after my studies, I did my articles. I actually passed my admittance exam before I was graduated, which was quite unique. So I graduated at COFSIS. Yes, so during my studies, I did two courses, R42, I think it was in 1986, and the R43 at 1987. Now, the Defence Force didn't just hand out ranks. So to be able to be promoted to the rank of captain, you had to do at least two courses. These signal courses at Heidelberg was on the brigade signal level, so it's a very high level. So you had to do the two courses, 6 weeks at a time. You did it in December, January, when you were supposed to be on holiday. And then you need a position. So I became the signal troop commander of the University of Orange Free State's military unit. You probably were also there. So that is how I became a captain. But we tried to do another camp. We found ourselves in Bloemfontein doing a camp. We wanted to go to the border as anybody else. And that is already in 87, 88. I would have really liked to be part of that. But our military unit were not recruited. I know other university military units did play their part. So we were not recruited. So I lost a bit of interest. And I did vacation work at the Free State gold mines. I was an onsetter underground mine, getting much more money that you receive from an army pay, and that sort of paid some of my studies. So yes, after that, I became an attorney. My career lasted over 32 years. I do a lot of litigation. Of course, you know the environment. One case that stands out in 2008, I argued the case in front of a Labour Appeal Court. I was actually appearing there in front of Honourable Judge Dennis Davis and the two more colleagues. And we argued the point on what's the definition of an employee. You should understand in labour law, the most important question to ask is who is an employee and who is an independent contractor. And that case, CETA versus CCMA, it is perhaps one of the most important cases. It was coincidence that I was part of that case, and I argued that case. And there, the definition of who is an employee, the dominant impression with economics and two more tests, was laid down in that case. And that debate was ended. And you've got very few cases, I think there's only one afterwards, that actually challenged that. So that is my career. I'm still practicing, writing books, in my spare time, do a lot of traveling, off-road, 4x4, visited all countries in Southern Africa. Of course, yeah, I'm a reborn Christian. My church organized outreach, and I managed to take 4 or 5, and I'm humbled to say this, teams to Namibia between 2004 and 2007. And we visited areas in Namibia, the Himbas, the Hererus and the Bushmans, they are there in the northeast. We had a missionary there who we support. And then one of our outreaches, we actually went back to East Kavango. So I was back in the area where we were, and we did a lot of work there, which was very fascinating to me. So the pastor is Henk Orwager. He serves that area. And then, yes, the rest are married. Karen is a professor. She's at University of Pretoria at the Gibbs Business School. My daughter is nearing completion of her law degree. So hopefully she will follow my footsteps. And then I've got a son. He's actually not far from you. He's in München. He's a software engineer. I'm very proud to say that he's finding life very, very exciting and make.
Yes, I have to say that the internet got hold of us just when you were talking about your son, but I think we got it is there. You'll have to learn to speak German if he wants to come and work here in Switzerland. But the money is good, I have to say. I don't think we're done with you, Marius. I'm going to invite you probably to talk about some of the other battles, if you don't mind, from your books. And also as an attorney, I'm sure that a man with your skills can give people a bit of advice, because, you know, I felt many people just sign a damn contract because they don't read it, and when they read it, they don't understand it. And that can cost you. It has cost me now, in my late mom's estate, 700,000, where people basically stole a house. But I'm going to make an entire episode on that as well, and I'm sure we're going to box a bit. It's one of those things. But thank you for this. Thank you for your time. If you people listening here, if you have any questions, please leave it below. But let me ask you, please don't become personal. Don't attack Colonel Hills. Don't attack anybody, you know, or make some nasty comments. I'm just going to ban you. I'm telling you, I'm going to ban you. Don't do it. Let us all come together. Let us together, and let us also honor the SWAPO people who fought excellently. They really had their act sorted out there. The way they were doing their mortar firing plan, to me, is indicative of good soldiers. Somebody trained them. They did very well. They captured the vehicles. I don't think it's the first time they actually got a Casper. There was a rumor in the police that Wambu warrant officer in Kufu actually deserted with a Casper here in the early 80s. I see you nodding your head. Do you know something about it, Marius?
Yeah, it's a bit off topic. It wasn't the Defence Force. In my article, which I wrote about deserted vehicles, you'll find that account as well.
Okay, we'll put the article in the description as well as links to your books and as well as links to your law office. And to the rest of you, please, guys, come and talk to me. Come and tell you your story. I mean, we're creating a legacy here for the SADF, as well as the security forces, the police, myself, where we come from. Let us tell our story. You know, it's an essential thing in law. Hear both sides. Do not judge us unless you heard our side as well. And thereafter we can, you know, see what history brings us. Thank you so much, Marius. Until we meet again, God bless.
It's been a privilege. Thank you. God bless.